Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, having led the revolution which overthrew the dictator Batista. Castro's close ties with the Soviet Union made the United States very nervous. Following covert attempts to topple Castro, an economic embargo, and the failure of the US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion by Cuban exiles in April 1961, this mistrust and unease led to a terrifying standoff later that year. It became known to the Russians as the Caribbean Crisis, to the Cubans as the October Crisis, and to the US and its allies as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Tensions rose when the United States deployed 15 Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey. A Jupiter's range of 1,500 miles meant that they were a direct threat to Moscow. The Russians reacted immediately, and US reconnaissance planes sent out on the 14th of October spotted missile launching sites being constructed in Cuba. The incriminating photographs were shown to the new President John F. Kennedy, who had succeeded Eisenhower in January. The escalating crisis soon became a baptism of fire for the 44-year-old president. Kennedy called a meeting of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Eschewing a surgical airstrike and resisting pressure from the Joint Chiefs of Staff for an all-out invasion, Kennedy decided that the best course of action was a naval blockade of Cuba. Although for reasons of international law, the term quarantine was used instead of blockade. Over the next few days, the Russians, via diplomat Andrei Gromyko, continued to deny the presence of any missiles in Cuba. But the U-2 reconnaissance planes reported that 4 Cuban sites were not only built, but fully operational. The Soviet Union's President Nikita Khrushchev labeled the quarantine an act of aggression. And amidst no let-up in the work on the missile sites, the Cubans prepared themselves for a US invasion. By the 25th of October, the crisis was at a head, with the US at defense readiness condition, DEFCON 2, for the first time in history, and the Soviets showing no signs of backing down. By the 27th of October, Castro was ready to fight, and he drafted a letter to Khrushchev calling for a preemptive strike on the United States. He also issued a directive that all Cuban anti-aircraft weapons should fire on any US aircraft. Previously, that order was only for groups of 2 or more aircraft. Khrushchev, however, remained calm, and the next morning he broadcast a message on Radio Moscow offering a new solution to the crisis. Khrushchev promised to remove the Cuban missiles if the Americans agreed to remove the Jupiters from Turkey, despite Turkey's continued insistence that they wanted the missiles to stay. During the next ExComm meeting, President Kennedy pushed for an agreement to Khrushchev's proposal, but his advisors were against it as they thought it would undermine NATO and Turkey. Around midday on the 27th, a US Lockheed U-2 plane was shot down in Cuba, adding to the tension. But Kennedy, despite earlier promising to launch an attack if that happened, held tight. By the end of the day, the US had drafted a letter to the USSR suggesting that they remove the weapons system from Cuba in exchange for the US removing the naval quarantine and promising not to invade Cuba. No mention was made of Turkey, but there was an unofficial agreement that the weapons in Turkey would be voluntarily dismantled after the standoff was resolved. The Americans didn't really expect a positive response to their message, but after the intervention of the United Nations, at 9 a.m. on the 28th of October, Khrushchev aired another broadcast on Radio Moscow, agreeing to dismantle the Cuban missiles and return them to the Soviet Union. The crisis was over, although many believed that the result was a compromise. But considering how close the world got to all-out nuclear war, a few bruised egos were a very small price to pay, indeed.